The dust in Dakota didn't just get on your skin. It burrowed its way into your soul, leaving a fine grit of pure desperation. For Josephine Bellwether, that desperation tasted like cold ash. Her little brother, Thomas, was burning up with a fever that was stealing the life right out of him. Their wagon was a pile of splintered matchsticks, and their last dollar was a ghost that had vanished weeks ago. There was only one hope left. A name whispered by a passing freighter. Mato Ohan, a Lakota man who owned the biggest spread this side of the Black Hills. A man who walked in the white world but wasn't part of it. When she finally found him, a man who looked like he was carved from the prairie itself, a man made of granite and silence. She begged him for a job, any job. His answer hit her like a lightning strike from a clear blue sky. "I will give you a home, protection, and pay," he said, his voice flat and hard. "But only if you marry me by sunset." The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked, thirsty earth. Josephine Bellwether shielded her eyes, but the glare was merciless. Out here, everything looked the same. A dead sea of sun-scorched grass, with hazy mountains shimmering in the distance like ghosts. Behind her, in the sliver of shade from their wrecked wagon, Thomas coughed. It was a dry, rattling sound, a sound like death, and it tore a piece out of her heart every time she heard it. They'd been stranded for 3 days. The axle had snapped clean in two on a rock that seemed to have been put there just for them. They'd left St. Louis with so much hope. They were chasing a new life, a clean slate, a place where the name Bellwether didn't mean shame and scandal. Their father, Alistair Bellwether, a big-shot banker, had been accused of embezzlement. He swore he was innocent until the day he died, but the stain wouldn't wash off. It clung to them like mud. They were outcasts. The West was supposed to be different. A place where a person's sweat mattered more than their name. Instead, it was an anvil, and Josephine felt it beating her into something brittle, something about to shatter. A grizzled freighter named Silas had told them about the Ohan Ranch. "Biggest spread this side of the Black Hills," he'd said, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice near her worn-out boots. "Run by an Indian, Mato Ohan. He's Lakota, but he owns the land, clear deed and all. Deals straight, pays fair. But he don't suffer fools." He was their last, most impossible chance. She left Thomas with the last drops of their water and walked. 4 miles under that brutal, unforgiving sun, following Silas's crude map scratched in the dirt. The Ohan Ranch didn't look like a settler's shack. It looked like it had grown right out of the plains. The main house was long and low, built from dark timber and smooth river stones. It looked solid, permanent. A corral, built with a craftsman's precision, held a dozen powerful-looking horses. In the distance, a river of brown cattle flowed across the grasslands. She found him by that corral. He wasn't breaking a horse with ropes and spurs. He was with a magnificent buckskin, an animal with a wild fire in its eye. He wasn't using force. He was using a quiet, unbreakable patience that was more commanding than any whip. He moved around the horse in a slow, hypnotic dance, his voice a low murmur she couldn't understand. He was taller than she'd expected, with shoulders as wide as a doorway and a lean strength that came from a life of hard work. His black hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. His face was all sharp angles and hard planes, burned to the color of rich copper by the sun. He wore simple canvas pants and a plain cotton shirt, but he moved with a grace that made most white men look clumsy and foolish. He didn't even look at her until the buckskin finally lowered its head and let him touch its muzzle. Only then did his eyes, dark and sharp as a hawk's, settle on her. They held no warmth, only a deep, unsettling stillness. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. His voice was a low baritone, the words clipped, precise. "I'm looking for Mato Ohan." Her own voice was a dry croak. "You found him." He didn't offer his hand. He didn't smile. He just waited. She swallowed the lump of pride and fear in her throat. "My name is Josephine Bellwether. My brother and our wagon is broken down by Red Bear Creek. He's sick. We have no money left. I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, mend. I'm educated. I can keep ledgers, write letters. I'll do anything. I'm a hard worker." The words tumbled out, a desperate, frantic rush. Mato Ohan listened without a single flicker of expression. His gaze swept over her, taking in the fine dust coating her dress, the wild desperation in her eyes, the patch of sunburn on her nose. It wasn't a man looking at a woman. It was a rancher judging livestock. He looked past her, toward the empty horizon, his jaw tight. "You're one of Alistair Bellwether's children," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. The blood drained from her face. The scandal. It had followed them all the way out here. Of course it had. "My father's troubles are not my own," she said, her voice shaking just a little. "I'm simply asking for a job." He was silent for a long, long time. The only sounds were the soft nicker of the horse and the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. She was sure he was going to say no, to send her walking back to her dying brother, to leave them to be baked into the prairie dust. When he finally spoke, his eyes met hers with an intensity that pinned her to the spot. "The work I have isn't for a cook or a maid," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But I have a position to fill, a permanent one." A wild, reckless hope surged in her chest. "I'll take it, whatever it is. You haven't heard the terms." He took a step closer. His presence was overwhelming, like standing next to a mountain. He wasn't threatening, but he was a force of nature. "I will send my men to fetch your brother and your wagon. I will see that he gets medicine from my people. I will give you a home in that house, a roof that doesn't leak, and a hearth that is always warm. You will have protection, food, and a wage that will make you comfortable." It was salvation. It was everything she had prayed for, and more. "Thank you," she breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Ohan. What is the job?" His face was still a stoic mask, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Calculation, grim necessity. "I need a wife," he said. The words dropped like stones into the dead silence. Josephine just stared. Her mind went completely blank. I beg your pardon?" "A wife," he repeated, his voice flat, empty of all emotion. "It is a business arrangement, a contract. It is the only position I have available." He glanced up at the sun, which was already starting its slow slide toward the western horizon. "I'll give you everything I promised," he continued, his gaze returning to her, sharp and absolute. "Only if you'll marry me by sunset." The world spun. The wind died. The very air grew thick and heavy, pressing in on her. All Josephine could hear was the frantic drumming of her own heart, a terrified bird trapped in her ribs. A wife. It was insane. It was an insult. It was the kind of indecent proposal you hear whispered about in the back rooms of saloons, not declared in the bright, open sunlight. That's absurd," she stammered, a hot blush flooding her cheeks. "Why? Why would you demand such a thing?" "My reasons are my own," Mato said, his voice unchanging. "They are practical, not romantic. This is not a proposal of the heart, Miss Bellwether. It is a contract, a solution to both our problems. You need sanctuary. I need a wife." He paused, and his eyes narrowed just slightly. "Specifically, a white wife." The bluntness of it was a slap in the face. A white wife. She was a tool, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. Her pride, already battered and bruised, screamed in protest. "I am not for sale, Mr. Ohan." "I'm not buying you," he countered, his tone hardening. I'm offering you a partnership that will ensure your survival. Look around you, Miss Bellwether. This land doesn't care about your pride. It will bake you in the summer and freeze you in the winter. The fever in your brother won't wait for you to feel dignified. I am offering him medicine and a warm bed. I'm offering you a life. Your other option is to walk back to that broken wagon and wait for the vultures. Every single word was true. The thought of Thomas, his breath growing shallower by the hour, was a knife twisting in her gut. She could see his pale face, his trusting eyes. She had promised him she would protect him, that she would get them to a new life. What was her pride compared to his life? "Why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why by sunset?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. Impatience. He gestured toward a distant line of hills, where the outline of another, smaller ranch was barely visible. "That is Jedediah Kane's land. He wants this valley. He has lawyers in Cheyenne and Washington. He uses their laws like a club to beat people with. According to their laws, a man like me, a Lakota man, has a weak hold on his own land, no matter what the treaties say. But a man like me with a legal American wife, a white wife, his claim becomes ironclad." He locked his eyes on hers. "Kane is making a legal challenge at the land office in Deadwood. The filing is tomorrow at dawn. To counter it, the marriage must be registered today. The circuit judge is passing through the trading post at dusk. It is my only move." It was a cold, hard calculation. Law and land and race. She was a shield. A legal loophole he could wear on his arm. It was the most insulting thing she had ever heard. And it was also, she had to admit, a brilliant, ruthless strategy. She thought of the men back in St. Louis, the ones with soft hands and hungry smiles who had offered her protection after her father's fall. They had wanted to own her, body and soul. Mato Ohan, for all his shocking directness, was offering her a contract. He wasn't talking about love or affection. He was talking about survival. He was treating her like an equal in a desperate negotiation. "What would be expected of me?" she asked. The shock was fading, replaced by a grim, hard pragmatism she didn't know she possessed. "You would live in my house. You would carry my name. You would be seen in town on my arm. In public, you would be my wife." He paused, and his gaze was unwavering. "In private, we would be strangers under the same roof. This is not about the marriage bed. This is about the law. You will have your own room. Your brother will have his own. You will not be touched." That last promise, delivered with the same flat finality as the rest, was what settled it. He wasn't a predator. He was a general fighting a war she couldn't see. She looked down at her own hands, raw and chapped from work they were never meant to do. She thought of Thomas, dying in the dirt. She looked at Mato Ohan, a man of the very land that was trying to kill her, offering her a way to beat it. "There will be a document," she said, her voice finding a surprising strength. "A written contract. It will state the terms, that I am a wife in name only, that a portion of the wage you mentioned is set aside for my brother and myself in an account under my name, and that if this arrangement is dissolved, I leave with that money and safe passage to the nearest city." For the first time, something that looked like respect entered his eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "That is acceptable. I will have it drawn up." "Then you have your wife, Mr. Ohan," Josephine said, lifting her chin. The words felt like stones in her mouth, but she said them. "But I will not be Mrs. Ohan. If I am to be a partner in this contract, you will call me by my name. Josephine." "As you wish, Josephine," he replied. A faint, wry smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second, then vanished. "My name is Mato." He turned and shouted a string of words in a language she had never heard before. Two Lakota men emerged from a nearby bunkhouse. They were younger than Matto, with the same lean, powerful build. He spoke to them, his voice sharp and authoritative, gesturing back the way she had come. They nodded and moved toward the stables with a smooth, purposeful stride. "They will bring your brother and your belongings," Matto said, turning back to her. "The tall one is Satan, the other is Nagi. They are good men. Thomas will be cared for." He looked at the sun, a fiery orange ball now bleeding across the horizon. "We have a judge to meet." The wedding was a fever dream. The judge, a portly man named Harlan Finch, with a whiskey sweat sheen on his brow and food stains on his coat, held court in the back room of a dusty, cluttered trading post. He reeked of cheap liquor and impatience. He barely even looked up from the marriage certificate as he mumbled the words. The only witnesses were the trading post owner, a wiry man named Peterson, and Matto's man Satan, who stood by the door like a silent bronze statue, his face completely unreadable. Josephine stood beside Matto, her hand trembling. He felt like a furnace next to her, a solid wall of heat and coiled energy. When the judge grunted, "You may kiss the bride," a tense, awkward silence fell over the room. Matto simply took her hand. His grip was firm and dry. He gave it a brief, formal squeeze. It was the sealing of a contract, nothing more. The judge, pocketing the fee Matto slid across the table, didn't seem to notice or care. The ride back to the ranch was completely silent. The sun had set, and the prairie was a world of deep violets and inky blues. The stars came out, scattered across the vast, dark canvas with a brilliance she had never seen under the gaslit skies of St. Louis. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. She was married to a stranger. She was heading to a home that wasn't hers. She was in a world that felt as alien as the surface of the moon. The house was bigger on the inside than it looked. The main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, the mantel a single polished log of dark wood. The furniture was simple, sturdy, and well made. A long dining table, comfortable-looking leather chairs. There were no fussy curtains, no delicate knickknacks like she was used to. Instead, the walls were adorned with intricately beaded Lakota crafts and beautifully painted hides depicting scenes of hunts and horses. It was a man's home, but more than that, it was a Lakota home. She was the outsider here. Thomas was already there. He was tucked into a small, clean room with a comfortable bed. He was sleeping, his breathing still shallow, but more peaceful than before. An older Lakota woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled map sat by his bed, humming a low, quiet song and placing a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. "This is Winona," Matto said from behind her. "She is a healer. She will watch over him." Josephine wanted to rush to her brother's side, but she felt frozen, an unwelcome guest in her own life. The woman, Winona, looked up at her, her dark eyes holding a deep, ancient wisdom. She offered a small, hesitant smile. It was the first flicker of warmth Josephine had received all day. Matto then led her to another room. "This will be yours." It was Spartan but clean, a simple wooden bed frame, a washstand, a small wardrobe. A window looked out over the vast, dark prairie. It was a room for a servant or a guest. It was not a bride's chamber. She felt a strange mix of profound relief and a hollow ache she couldn't name. "The ledgers are in the study," he said, pausing at the door. "You can begin in the morning. Winona will bring you food." He paused for a moment. "Good night, Josephine." He left, closing the door softly behind him, and she was alone. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the coarse blanket rough beneath her fingers. She was Josephine Ohan. The name felt wrong in her mouth, a costume she was being forced to wear. She had saved her brother, but in doing so, she had sold herself. Her name, her future, all for the price of his safety. She didn't cry, The tears were frozen solid somewhere deep inside her, locked away with her fear. The next morning, the reality of her strange new life began to set in. Mato was already gone when she awoke, out on the range long before sunrise. She found the study, a small practical room lined with books on animal husbandry and engineering, sitting incongruously beside texts written in a language she didn't recognize. The ledgers were immaculate. Every transaction was recorded in a neat, precise hand. Mato was not just a rancher, he was a shrewd, careful businessman. Her job was to continue his meticulous work, recording sales of cattle, purchases of feed, and wages for the half-dozen Lakota hands who worked the ranch. They treated her with a polite, impenetrable distance. They would nod when she passed, but their eyes were guarded. She was the white woman, the boss's strange, sudden wife. She was an outsider, a ghost in their home. The first real test of her new role came 2 days later. A rider approached the ranch. He didn't have the easy loping gait of the Lakota hands. He rode with an arrogant swagger that was visible even from a distance. As he drew closer, she saw he was a large, florid man with pale, watchful eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. He rode a fine black stallion and wore a tailored coat that was ridiculously out of place in this rugged, dusty land. Mato met him in the yard, standing with his feet planted, his posture radiating a quiet, immovable strength. Josephine watched from the porch, her heart pounding in her chest. "Oh, Han," the man said, his voice a rich baritone that dripped with condescension. "I heard some peculiar news from the trading post. Came to see if it was true." "If you're here, Kane, you already know it's true," Mato replied, his voice perfectly level. So this was him, Jedediah Kane, the enemy. He looked from Mato to Josephine on the porch, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. "Well, I'll be," Kane drawled, tipping his hat in a mocking gesture. The savage found himself a little white dove. "You must have been mighty desperate, little lady, to tie yourself to this." He let the word hang in the air, thick with unspoken venom. "Thing. What did he offer you? A string of beads? A new blanket?" A hot surge of anger, fierce and unexpected, shot through Josephine. Whatever her arrangement with Mato was, it was hers. She would not be mocked by this odious, pompous man. She walked down the porch steps and stood beside Mato, lifting her chin. It was a performance, but damn it, she would play her part. "Mr. Kane," she said, her voice clear and cold as ice. "My husband and I are quite busy. If you have business here, I suggest you state it. Otherwise, you are trespassing." Kane's smile faltered for just a second. His eyes narrowed as he took in her defiant stance. Mato glanced at her, a flicker of surprise in his own eyes. "Husband," Kane repeated, savoring the word like it was a piece of sour candy. "A piece of paper from a drunk judge doesn't make a marriage. And it won't save this land for you, Ohan. This valley belongs to men who know how to build, not squatters. I'll see you ruined." "You've been trying for 5 years, Kane," Mato said, his voice dangerously soft. "The land is still mine. My wife is here. The law is satisfied. Now get off my property." Kane's face turned a mottled shade of purple. He spat on the ground, a gob of brown saliva landing near Josephine's feet. "Enjoy your sham marriage while it lasts," he snarled. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust that settled over them like a shroud. The air crackled with tension. The performance was over. Josephine felt herself begin to tremble, a delayed reaction to the ugly confrontation. "You did well," Mato said quietly, not looking at her. "He needed to see a united front." "He's a vile man," she whispered. "He's a patient one," Mato corrected. "He won't stop." He turned and walked toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard. She had played her part. She had stood by her husband. But the cold knot of fear in her stomach told her that Jedediah Kane was not a man who gave up easily. Their sunset contract hadn't bought them peace. It had just officially declared war. Weeks bled into a month. A fragile routine began to form, thin as a spider's web. Josephine managed the ledgers with an efficiency that surprised even herself. She tracked every penny, every head of cattle, every bag of flour. It was a language of numbers and facts, a welcome refuge from the confusing emotional landscape of her new life. Thomas was slowly, miraculously recovering. Winona's traditional remedies, brews of willow bark and yarrow, poultices of sage, seemed to work where the expensive St. Louis doctor's tonics had failed. He was still thin, but the fever was gone, and some color had returned to his cheeks. He adored Winona, and was picking up snippets of the Lakota language from the ranch hands, who had gradually softened toward the boy, if not toward his sister. Mato remained an enigma. He was a phantom in his own house, rising before dawn and returning long after dusk, smelling of horse and dust and sweat. They shared their meals in a thick, uncomfortable silence, broken only by necessary questions about ranch business. He was polite, remote, utterly inaccessible. Yet she saw glimpses of the man beneath the stone facade. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horses, the deep respect his men held for him, the quiet way he would listen to Thomas's excited chatter about a horned lizard or a circling hawk. The wall between them, she realized, was his past. She knew nothing about it except that it held a deep and profound sorrow. The evidence was in a small, locked cherry-wood box on the mantelpiece. One evening, driven by a loneliness so profound it was a physical ache, she found the key. It was hidden in the back of the study desk drawer where he kept spare keys for the ranch. Her hands shook as she unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside there was no treasure, no gold or jewels. There was a single, perfect eagle feather, a lock of jet-black hair tied with a strip of colored sinew, and a small, worn photograph. It was a portrait of Mato, a younger, smiling Mato, his arm wrapped around a beautiful Lakota woman. Her face was full of light and laughter, her eyes sparkling with a joy so pure it hurt to look at. On the back of the photo, a single word was written in a delicate, flowing hand. Anpetu. The name was like a key, turning a lock in her own heart. This was his wife, his real wife, the woman he had loved. Anpetu. The name meant daybreak. Josephine closed the box, a wave of shame and something that felt strangely like grief washing over her. She was a placeholder, a legal necessity occupying the space a great love had left vacant. His coldness wasn't for her. It was a fortress he had built around a wound that had never healed. Her new knowledge colored everything. She began to see the ranch not just as Mato's fortress, but as Anpetu's home. The intricate beadwork, the painted hides, had her hands made them. The small patch of hardy wildflowers near the porch, had she planted them? A trip to the trading post for supplies a week later provided more pieces of the puzzle. Beatrice Peterson, the owner's daughter, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, cornered her by the bolts of calico. "Quite the stir you've caused, Mrs. Ohan," Beatrice said, her voice a saccharine purr. "Marrying him like that, so sudden." "It was a private matter," Josephine replied stiffly, not wanting to engage in gossip. "Oh, of course," Beatrice smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just that no one thought he'd ever marry again, not after Ampetu. Such a tragedy." She leaned in conspiratorially. She was a beauty, kind as a summer day. Everyone loved her. Her horse threw her, down by the creek. A terrible accident. Happened a year ago last spring. Josephine felt a chill crawl up her spine despite the stuffy heat of the store. Jedediah Kane was sweet on her, you know, Beatrice continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. Before she married Maddo, he couldn't stand that she chose a redskin over him. Caused a terrible scene right here in this store. Kane's not a man who forgets a slight. Funny thing about that accident. Her horse was the calmest mare you'd ever seen. Knew that trail like the back of its own hoof. The insinuation was clear, and it was ugly. An accident that wasn't an accident. A motive born of racist hatred and spurned obsession. It cast Jedediah Kane's threats in a new, more sinister light. He didn't just want Maddo's land. He wanted to destroy him utterly, to take everything from him, just as he might have already taken Anpitu. That night, Josephine couldn't sleep. The pieces were slotting together into a horrifying picture of grief, obsession, and potential murder. Maddo's fight with Kane wasn't just about cattle and deeds. It was a silent, simmering war over a dead woman. His proposal to her, his desperate need for a white wife to secure his land, it wasn't just a legal strategy. It was a way to protect the last thing he had left of Anpitu, the home they had built together. She finally understood. His distance wasn't a rejection of her. It was a testament to his loyalty to a memory. He wasn't just a stoic rancher. He was a grieving widower, locked in a deadly battle with the man who may have murdered his wife. And she, Josephine Bellwether, the disgraced banker's daughter, was now standing right in the middle of the battlefield. She had signed a contract for her own survival, only to find she had enlisted in a war she was not prepared to fight. The prairie wind rattling the window pane sounded like a woman's mournful whisper. And for the first time since arriving in this God-forsaken land, Josephine felt a tremor of genuine, bone-deep fear. Jedediah Kane's campaign of harassment escalated. The veiled threats turned into open aggression. One night, a section of fence was cut, and 30 head of prime cattle were driven off into the darkness. A week later, one of the northern wells was found fouled with a dead coyote, poisoning the water for 100 acres of pasture land. Maddo and his men worked tirelessly, their faces grim, their silences deeper than ever. Maddo himself seemed to be carved from stone, his exhaustion showing only in the tighter set of his jaw and the dark shadows that appeared beneath his eyes. Josephine felt a frustrating sense of helplessness. She managed the ledgers, documenting the financial losses, with a cold, clear precision that felt utterly inadequate. She was a part of this fight, yet she was confined to paper and ink, while the real battle was fought with wire cutters and poison on the open range. It was during one of her meticulous reviews of the supply accounts that she first noticed the anomaly. It was small, almost insignificant. A receipt for 3 spools of high-tensile barbed wire from Peterson's trading post, signed for by a ranch hand named Pete Gallagher. The date was from 2 weeks prior. She remembered the purchase. They had needed it to repair a fence line near the bluffs. But when she cross-referenced it with the work logs Maddo kept, she saw that Pete, along with another hand, had been assigned to the south pasture that entire week. The bluffs were 5 miles in the opposite direction. Pete Gallagher was the only white man Maddo employed. He was a drifter who had shown up a year ago, a decent rider and a hard worker who mostly kept to himself. He was quiet, with shifty eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze. The Lakota men treated him with a polite but distinct coolness. A single discrepancy was probably a mistake, but it nagged at her. She started going back through the previous month's ledgers, her pen flying across the pages. She found more. A bill for an expensive grain supplement that was never logged in the barn inventory. A request for double the usual amount of kerosene just before a small haystack mysteriously caught fire one night. Each questionable transaction, every single one, was linked to Pete Gallagher. He was skimming supplies, at the very least, but the timing of the incidents, The way they lined up perfectly with Kane's sabotage suggested something far, far worse. The snake wasn't just circling the ranch, it was already inside the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to be sure. Accusing one of Matto's men without irrefutable proof would shatter the fragile trust she was beginning to build. It could destroy her credibility and make her position here impossible. Her chance came 2 nights later. She saw Pete slip away from the bunkhouse after the evening meal. He wasn't heading toward the trading post for a drink. He was heading east, toward Kane's property. Throwing a dark shawl over her shoulders, she crept out of the house, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the packed earth. The moon was just a slender sliver, providing little light. She kept to the shadows, her breath held tight in her chest, following the faint sounds of his horse. He led her to a small hidden coulee about a mile from the ranch border. There, a second figure was waiting, a cigarillo glowing like a single red firefly in the dark. As Josephine crept closer, hiding behind a dense cluster of sagebrush, the acrid smell of the smoke reached her. The man turned, and the faint moonlight caught the familiar, heavy-set profile of Jedediah Kane. "You're late, Gallagher," Kane's voice rumbled, low and dangerous. "Had to wait for them to settle in," Pete whined, his voice thin and reedy. "That Indian, he watches everything. What have you got for me?" "He's moving the rest of the herd to the high pasture tomorrow. Thinks they'll be safer there. The north fence is weak by the old cottonwood. A stampede would send them right over the ravine." Josephine's blood ran cold. A stampede would mean the loss of half of Matto's remaining herd. It would be a catastrophic, potentially bankrupting blow. "Good," Kane grunted, a sound of deep, ugly satisfaction. "And the woman? His new wife?" "She stays in the house, scribbling in his books," Pete said with a sneer. "Thinks she's a damn queen. Hasn't got a clue. He don't even sleep with her. The men are saying he still moons over that dead squaw of his." "He'll have plenty to moon over when he's begging for scraps," Kane said. He tossed his cigarillo to the ground and ground it out with his heel. He passed a small, heavy pouch to Pete. The clink of coins was unmistakable. "Start the run just before dawn. Make it look like a wolf scare. And Gallagher," Kane's voice dropped, becoming hard as iron, "if this goes wrong, I don't know you." "It won't go wrong," Pete assured him, his voice thick with greed. Josephine didn't wait to hear more. She backed away slowly, silently, her mind racing. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to move with deliberate care until she was out of earshot. Then she flew. Her feet barely touched the ground, the thorny branches of greasewood tearing at her skirt. She burst into the main room of the house, her chest heaving, her hair wild. Matto was there, sitting by the low fire, cleaning a rifle. He looked up, his eyes widening in alarm at her state. "Josephine, what is it?" "It's Pete," she gasped, leaning against the door frame to support her trembling legs. "Pete Gallagher. He's working for Kane. I saw them. I heard them." She poured out the whole story, the ledgers, the discrepancies, the meeting in the coulee. She told him about the planned stampede at dawn, her words tumbling over one another in her desperate haste. Matto listened, his expression hardening into a mask of cold, lethal fury. He didn't question her. He didn't doubt her for a single second. The evidence she had gathered, the risk she had taken, it was all there in her terrified, determined eyes. He stood up, the rifle looking like a toy in his massive hands. "Where?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "The north fence, by the old cottonwood. They plan to send the herd into the ravine." He gave a sharp, single nod. He strode to the wall and pulled down a well-worn gun belt, strapping it around his hips. "Satan! Nagi!" he bellowed, his voice echoing through the quiet house. His men appeared almost instantly, their faces alert and questioning. He spoke to them in rapid Lakota, his words sharp and commanding. Their eyes widened, then narrowed with a shared deadly purpose. They disappeared and returned moments later, armed and ready. Mato turned back to Josephine. Her part was over. She expected him to tell her to stay inside, to lock the doors. Instead, he looked at her. Truly looked at her for the first time since she had arrived. He saw not just the white wife or the bookkeeper, but the woman who had just risked her life for his ranch, for his home. "You have a good eye and a strong heart, Josephine," he said, his voice quiet but filled with a respect that warmed her more than any fire. "Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." He and his men melted into the night, leaving Josephine alone in the silent house, the weight of the coming dawn pressing down on her like a physical blow. She had uncovered the snake, but now it was cornered. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that a cornered snake was the most dangerous kind of all. The silence that followed their departure was worse than any noise. Josephine barred the heavy oak door and began to pace the main room like a caged animal. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every creak of the old house was a harbinger of violence. She had given Mato the information, but what if their trap failed? What if Kane had more men waiting? She couldn't just wait. It wasn't in her nature anymore. She went to the study and lit a lamp, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries. She pulled out a map of the ranch that Mato had drawn. She found the north pasture, the old cottonwood, the ravine. It was a treacherous piece of land, a perfect place for an ambush. Mato and his men were walking into a situation where they could easily be outnumbered. Her eyes fell upon the rifle Mato had been cleaning, an old heavy Winchester he kept mounted above the fireplace. She had never fired a gun in her life. Her father had considered it unladylike. But she had watched Mato and his men practice. She knew how to load it. With a resolve that came from the deepest well of her fear, she took the rifle down. It was heavy, smelling of gun oil and steel. She found the ammunition in the study desk, and with clumsy, fumbling fingers, she managed to load the chamber. She would not be a helpless woman waiting for rescue. This was her home now, bought and paid for with her name, her freedom. She would defend it. An hour before dawn, the prairie erupted. It started as a low rumble, a vibration she felt through the floorboards that quickly grew into the thunder of 1,000 panicked hooves. The stampede. It was happening. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. Then came the sharp crack of rifle fire. Sporadic at first, then a full-blown fusillade. Muzzle flashes lit up the pre-dawn horizon like angry, swarming fireflies. She ran to the window, her knuckles white on the heavy stock of the Winchester, peering into the darkness. She could see nothing but distant, chaotic flashes of light. The sounds of the battle seemed to last an eternity. The thunder of the herd receded, and the gunfire became more sporadic, finally sputtering into an unnerving, absolute silence. Who had won? Was Mato alive? Was he hurt? The waiting was the worst torture she had ever endured. The sky began to lighten in the east, painting the clouds in shades of gray and rose. Just as the first rays of sun crested the horizon, she saw them. 3 riders approaching the house. It was Mato, Satan, and Nagi. They were leading a 4th horse, upon which a figure was slumped and tied. Pete Gallagher. Relief washed over her, so potent it left her weak. She fumbled with the bar on the door and threw it open, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands. Mato slid from his horse, his face streaked with dirt and gunpowder. He had a bloody gash on his forearm, but he was alive. His eyes found her in the doorway, saw the rifle, and his expression was one of pure astonishment. "The herd is safe," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "We turned them before they reached the ravine. Gallagher won't be a problem anymore." Satan and Nagi dismounted, hauling the treacherous ranch hand from his horse and dragging him toward the small, sturdy smokehouse that would serve as a temporary cell. Pete was groaning, a dark bruise swelling on his cheek where it was clear Matto's fist had connected. Josephine's eyes were locked on the bloody gash on Matto's arm. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he grunted, but as he moved toward the porch, he swayed, a wave of dizziness hitting him. She rushed forward, grabbing his good arm to steady him. The contact sent a jolt through both of them. It was the first time they had touched with anything other than cold formality. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice firm. She led him inside and pushed him gently into a chair by the fire. Winona appeared, her face a mask of concern, but Josephine, acting on pure instinct, said, "I'll handle this." She fetched the medical supplies, carbolic acid, clean linen bandages, hot water. Her hands, which had trembled while loading the rifle, were now perfectly steady as she cleaned the wound. It was a deep graze, torn open by a bullet. He winced as she disinfected it, hissing through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. He just watched her, his dark eyes intense, reading her face in the flickering firelight. "You had the Winchester," he said, his voice quiet. "I wasn't going to wait here uselessly," she replied, her fingers working deftly as she wrapped the bandage. "This is my home too." The words hung in the air between them. My home. In that moment, it was true. It had ceased to be a simple sanctuary and had become something she would fight for, bleed for. When she finished, she tied off the bandage and finally looked up, meeting his gaze. The walls between them, the carefully constructed barriers of their business arrangement, had been burned away in the fire of the night's battle. He wasn't just her husband in name. He was her partner, her ally. And she, in his eyes, was no longer just a legal shield, but a woman of unexpected, astonishing courage. He reached out his uninjured hand and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was not one of passion, but of something deeper, more profound: gratitude, respect, a dawning awe. "Josephine," he said, and her name on his lips sounded different now, imbued with a new meaning. "Thank you." The quiet intimacy of the moment was shattered by a shout from outside. Satan stood in the doorway, his face grim. "Matto, we found this on Gallagher." He held up a blood-stained piece of paper. "It's a signed confession. He admits Kane paid him for the rustling, the well, but there's more." He took a breath. "He says Kane was the one who spooked Anpitu's horse. He says it was no accident. Kane meant for her to die." The truth, stark and terrible, filled the room, sucking all the air from it. Matto's face went pale beneath his tan, his expression crumbling into one of pure, raw agony. The wound on his arm was nothing compared to the one that had just been torn open in his soul. He looked from the confession in Satan's hand to Josephine's horrified face, and she saw a man pushed to the very edge of his endurance. Jedediah Kane hadn't just been trying to take his land. He was a murderer who had gotten away with it. And now, the war was no longer about property. It was about justice. A justice the law might never provide. The confession changed everything. This was no longer a war of attrition. It was a blood feud. Matto dispatched Nagi to ride for Sheriff Pike in Deadwood, a full day's ride away, carrying Pete Gallagher's signed statement. But everyone in the room knew Jedediah Kane would not wait patiently for the law to come for him. A cornered animal is at its most vicious, and Kane was now cornered. Matto was a different man. The stoic calm was gone, replaced by a coiled, lethal intensity. The grief he had buried for over a year was now a whetstone, sharpening his rage to a razor's edge. He was preparing for a siege. He, Satan, and the other Lakota hands, a force of only 5 men, began barricading the windows and creating firing positions in the barn and the main house. Josephine refused to be relegated to the sidelines. "What can I do?" she demanded, following Matto as he checked their stores of ammunition. He paused and looked at her, his eyes dark with the storm inside him. "Load every rifle and stay away from the windows." She didn't argue. She found her place at the long dining table and began the grim, methodical work of filling cartridges. Her hands moved with a newfound purpose. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly, but it was overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. Cain had taken Matto's first wife. She would not let him take anything else. Thomas, pale and frightened, was hidden with Winona in the root cellar, the safest place on the ranch. The attack came in the late afternoon. Cain didn't come alone. He had brought a dozen men, hired guns and ranch hands loyal to his money. A small army against their handful of defenders. They rode in not as a posse, but as a marauding band, spreading out to surround the ranch buildings. "Matto Ohan!" Cain's voice boomed across the yard. "You've got something that belongs to me. That lying coward Gallagher. Send him out, and we can end this." "Gallagher stays here until the sheriff arrives, Cain," Matto yelled back from a window in the main house. "He's going to tell them everything. About the cattle, the water, and about Enpedu." There was a moment of charged silence. Then Cain's enraged roar echoed across the prairie. "Open fire!" The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. Bullets splintered the wood of the house, shattering the few remaining panes of glass. Josephine dropped to the floor, her heart pounding against her ribs. From the barn and the house, Matto and his men returned fire, their shots measured and precise, a stark contrast to the wild, undisciplined volley from Cain's men. The siege was a nightmare of noise, smoke, and the constant, acrid smell of gunpowder. Hours crawled by. Josephine kept the rifles loaded, her hands raw and aching. Twice Cain's men tried to charge the house, and twice they were beaten back by the deadly accuracy of the defenders. Satan was hit in the shoulder, but Winona, emerging from the cellar, patched him up with grim determination, and he was back at his post within minutes. As dusk began to settle, Cain grew desperate. Under the cover of the failing light, he and two of his men made a dash for the house, using a water trough for cover. They were trying to set it ablaze. "Josephine, the back window!" Matto yelled. She scrambled to the small window at the back of the house, the Winchester heavy in her hands. She could see them. 3 figures, crouched by the corner of the house, one holding a lit torch. Her hands trembled. These were not targets, they were men, but they were threatening to burn her home down around her, to kill the people who had become her family. She rested the barrel on the sill, took a deep breath, and remembered how Matto had stood, calm and centered. She aimed not at a man, but at the torch. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked back hard against her shoulder, the noise deafening in the small room. The torch exploded in a shower of sparks and fell harmlessly to the ground. One of Cain's men yelped, grabbing his hand. The element of surprise was gone. From the barn a single shot rang out, and another of the men fell. Cain, cursing, dragged his wounded man back into the darkness. The fighting subsided into a tense standoff as darkness fell completely. They were trapped. Ammunition was running low. It was only a matter of time. Suddenly, from the east, a new sound emerged, the thunder of many horses riding hard. For a heart-stopping moment, Josephine thought Cain had brought reinforcements. But then a voice cut through the night, clear and authoritative. "In the name of the law, cease fire. This is Sheriff Pike. Lay down your weapons." Relief, so powerful and absolute it was dizzying, flooded the besieged ranch. Sheriff Pike had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. He had a posse of 10 deputies with him. Nagy had made it through. Trapped between the ranch defenders and the law, Kane's men threw down their guns in surrender. But Kane was not among them. Matto saw him first. A single figure, breaking from the darkness, running not toward the law, but toward the creek. Red Bear Creek, where Anpetu had died. With a guttural cry, Matto vaulted through the shattered window and gave chase. This was not for the sheriff. This was for him. Josephine watched in horror, then, without thinking, ran after him. She found them on the bank of the creek, 2 dark silhouettes against the rising moon. Kane had a knife. Matto had only his bare hands. They circled each other, panting like wolves. "You took her from me!" Kane screamed, his voice raw with madness and hate. "She should have been mine." "You defiled her name," Matto snarled, his voice a low growl of pure agony. "You took the sun from my sky." Kane lunged. The fight was brutal, primal. They crashed into the shallow water, fists and fury. Josephine screamed. A gunshot rang out, Sheriff Pike firing into the air. When the lawman finally pulled them apart, Kane was a blubbering, broken mess. Matto stood dripping and bruised, his chest heaving. His eyes found Josephine's across the creek bed. In their depths, she saw the storm finally break. The rage was gone, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness, but also, for the first time, a glimmer of peace. Justice, in its own raw way, had been served. The dust settled. Kane and his men were led away in chains. The sun rose on a battered but unbroken Ohan ranch. As the dawn light spilled across the valley, Matto stood beside Josephine on the porch, looking out at the land that was still theirs. The bandage on his arm was dirty, her dress was torn, and the house behind them was scarred with bullet holes. "The contract we made," he said, his voice quiet. "It's fulfilled. The ranch is secure. You are free to go as we agreed. I'll give you the money and safe passage." Josephine looked at him, at his proud, wounded face. She looked at the house, at the endless prairie sky. She thought of St. Louis, of the life she had fled. It was a ghost, a half-forgotten dream. This, the dust, the danger, the quiet strength of the man beside her. This was real. "A contract can be renegotiated," she said softly. "Perhaps this one is no longer about a white wife or a legal shield." He turned to her, a question in his weary eyes. "Perhaps," she continued, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "It could be about a partner, about building something new, right here, together." Matto looked at her, at the woman who had faced down his enemies, who had defended his home, who had seen the broken man behind the warrior and had not fled. He reached out and took her hand, not as a seal on a deal, but as an anchor in a stormy world. His grip was warm and strong, and for the first time, it felt like coming home. And so, a marriage born from a desperate bargain at sunset became a union forged in the fires of conflict and sealed by mutual respect. Josephine Bellwether, the disgraced socialite, found her true strength not in a ballroom, but in the heart of the unforgiving Dakota territory. And Matto Ohan, the grieving Lakota warrior, found that a new day could dawn even after the most profound darkness. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most unlikely arrangements can lead to the truest partnerships, and that a home is not just a place you own, but something you build and fight for side by side. The Wild West was a land of brutal endings, but for them, it was the beginning of everything. If their story of resilience and unexpected love moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a true tale from the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next journey into the dramatic untold stories of history.